Okay, I think we'll get going. So thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Megan Burns. I'm a PhD student in agronomy, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Grad Student Council Professional Development Committee. So super excited today to have a really informative workshop with several different presenters, all about grant writing. For those of you who are attending the workshop who didn't receive my email this morning or didn't see it, I've dropped all of the presentation materials in the Zoom chat. So you should be able to access those there, as well as view the agenda for the next few hours here. I did receive several questions about whether or not you can leave and come back if you have a class or a meeting, etc. Please feel free to do so. And you should be able to access all of the presentation materials for any part that you have missed. If you are seeking credit, professional development certificate credit through the GSC, make sure that you have logged in to Zoom using your K-State account. Otherwise, we won't be able to track your attendance here and give you credit. And if you do need to leave for any reason, but you are seeking credit, you'll receive 1 credit if you are around for at least half of our event today, and you'll receive 2 credits if you attend the whole thing. Presenters, as we talked about, I'll let you guys take over the screen for each of you as you are up to present. And if anyone has any questions at any point about anything, you can drop your questions in the chat and we'll deal with those as they come up. So with that, I think we're ready to get going. So first of all, we're going to have a welcome from Dr. Beth Montalone, who's Senior Associate Vice President for Research in the Office of Research and Development. So I don't know, can you share your screen, or do you need me to give you the power to do that?
It looks like I can share. I'm not going to share right now. I will later.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. This workshop is sponsored by the Office of Research Development, which is part of the Office of the Vice President for Research. We're located over in Fairchild Hall, and we normally serve faculty, postdocs, and graduate students, help them find proposal opportunities and to polish up those proposals. This particular event, co-sponsored by the Graduate Student Council and the Kansas Postdoctoral Association, is a joint effort between my team from the Office of Research Development, as well as grant specialists from the College of Veterinary Medicine and the College of Agriculture and K-State Research and Extension. And then we also have an important segment that will be presented by the director at the Writing Center from the English department. So we are going to go over kind of everything from soup to nuts, as it were, about what is a grant, what are the processes that you need to know about how to apply for one, what are the written or unwritten rules that you should follow in grant writing, as well as some successful writing strategies. That'll be a more interactive session. And then after the break, we will talk about budgets and budget justifications. Those are always an important part of any grant proposal. And then I will close us off by talking about how grant proposals are reviewed at various agencies that are the sponsors of those awards. So I hope that you find this information helpful, and all of us, of course, are happy to address questions as we go in the chat or at the end of our individual presentations, or by contacting us separately by email following this event. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Amy Brusk from the College of Veterinary Medicine. Amy?
Hello. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here and see if I can get this to, let's see, share screen. And last year, Megan, I did have a bit of trouble getting this to work in slideshow mode, so please let me know if my slides are not moving.
Okay, we currently can't see your slides just yet.
Okay. Okay, how about now?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right, my name is Amy Brusk, and I'm a departmental grant specialist in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And I've been working in research administration for about 15 years. And my job here in VetMed is to assist faculty with the search for funding, preparing their proposal, managing the award once they've received the funding, and then closing out the grant. So I get to help PIs through that entire process from cradle to grave. Okay, did the slide change, Megan?
Yes, it did.
Oh, good, okay. So like I said, today I'm going to walk you through the proposal process. We're going to talk about the life cycle of a grant and some important grant terminology and acronyms that you'll need to know along the way. So this is a summary of the research support offices at K-State that help with the proposal and award process. Other universities typically have a similar structure. In grants, there are two main parts to the process. There's the pre-award side and then the post-award side. All grant proposals must go through the pre-award services office for review and approval prior to submission. The compliance office provides the oversight of live animal or biohazards, human subject, and recombinant DNA research. Any type of research that involves those do require specific approval through what's called an IACUC or an IBC. Lastly, the sponsored programs accounting office on the post-award side oversees the expenditures or spending of the grant money once it's awarded. And then a lot of times there's departmental grant offices, which is where I come from. And so those offices have grant personnel that are housed within their college or department to kind of be the boots on the ground with the faculty to help with every step of that grant process. Okay, so let's talk about the life cycle of a grant proposal. Your first step is to find funding opportunities. K-State has a website on their research page that has several sources for finding funding opportunities. Before I go to the next slide to talk more about that though, here's a list of acronyms that you may see as you search for funding. All of these listed here are terms that describe a mechanism of requesting applicants to propose ideas for some kind of sponsored project. There's small differences between each of these, but they're all basically the same thing. I did want to highlight the pre-proposal or white paper and letter of intent. Both of those are mechanisms that are often used prior to submitting a full proposal. A lot of times the sponsor will ask for a pre-proposal or letter of intent, which is often pretty brief, such as 1 or 2 pages. And then after reviewing these, the sponsor will reach out and invite a select few to apply for a full proposal process. So as I mentioned before, K-State has multiple resources for finding funding opportunities at the link on the previous slide. This is a list of some of those resources. The ORSP office at K-State sends out a weekly newsletter highlighting funding opportunities, as well as links to pertinent articles regarding research. The Pivot database is a subscription-based database that searches across a variety of sources for requests for proposals. And then grants.gov is the website for all federal funding opportunities. And K-State also offers some small internal grant programs, and there's an application process for those as well. Those are projects that will be funded by K-State. So those are what we often call intramural or internal grant programs. And then there's also the possibility that a company or entity from an industry wants to sponsor a research project. It's important to remember that as soon as you decide on a funding opportunity to apply for, to let your grant specialists know. Remember that we serve multiple faculty and are juggling multiple deadlines. So the sooner that you can get your deadline on their calendar, the better. This is a screenshot of what the Pivot database looks like. This is a subscription that K-State pays for. So I believe you need to be on campus for it to work, or at least sign in with your EID and password. And that way you can use the full search features that are available. It's basically a keyword search. So you type in some searchable words in the box at the top, and then Pivot will pull funding opportunities from pretty much anywhere. It does pull in some that we may not be eligible to submit to, so it's important to read through those details. This is a screenshot of what the results from Pivot look like. It's a list that shows the deadlines. This is an old screenshot, which is why it shows 2017. And it'll also show the amount of funds that are available, or kind of the ceiling that you can apply for. Pivot also pulls from overseas or international funding opportunities. So you may see some that are listed under foreign currencies. This is what grants.gov looks like. This is the federal database for federal funding opportunities, and it's similar to Pivot so that you can search based off of keywords. It pulls opportunities across any federal agency, so sometimes the amount of results that it provides you can be kind of lengthy. Fortunately, it does have filters on the left to narrow your search, like if you just wanted to make sure that you're searching under the USDA or NIH. Grants.gov is a bit clunky, and it's not terribly user-friendly for those that are not familiar on how to read through these. So be sure to work closely with your grant specialist, and a lot of times if you kind of give them an idea of what you're looking for, they can help you search for those. Okay, so you found a funding opportunity that you'd like to apply for, and now you need to start putting your proposal together. So as you start writing your proposal, you're going to see or hear the terms PI, PD, or COI. These are different roles of the personnel on the project. The principal investigator or project director are those that are leading the project. It is possible to have multiple PIs or PDs. However, just one will need to be named as the contact PD or PI. This is the person who the sponsor would communicate with regarding the notice of award. Also remember that the budget and at least an abstract or summary of your project must be reviewed by the pre-awards office or some kind of central office if you're at another university prior to the submission deadline. So you need to be sure and plan ahead and get started early. I'm not going to talk much about the budget because you'll have a separate presentation to go over that in detail. Just know that the budget is comprised of two basic costs, direct and indirect. The direct costs are those that are the direct expenses of the project, like supplies or equipment. The indirect costs are a percent of the direct costs, and those cover the university's overhead expense for providing the facilities and administration for the project. A lot of times you'll hear that called IDC, indirect cost, or F&A, which is the facility and administration cost of the project. The budget justification is a written narrative explaining and justifying the budget. Your grant specialist will help you put both of those together. So I've mentioned a few times now that the proposal must be reviewed and approved prior to submission. The person who authorizes those are known by a few acronyms that are listed here. AOR is the most common. That's authorized organizational representative, and ours is Paul Lowe in the pre-awards office. Paul is the last one to sign a proposal before it's submitted to the sponsor. And there's a couple of other here that you'll see. The most common acronym that's used is AOR. Okay, so each funding opportunity will have a set of guidelines or instructions that explains what the application package needs to include. This is just an example of some common documents that are often required. As a grant specialist, my job is to ease the administrative burden so that PIs can concentrate on writing the science of the proposal. So we thoroughly review the guidelines, which can often be pretty lengthy, and we help guide them and tell them what needs to be included. The project abstract is a brief document providing a summary of the project. The narrative is usually the longest document. That is the meat of your proposal, which outlines and fully explains what you're going to do. Then you'll usually have a document with your cited references. The facilities and other resources document explains what you currently have to do the project, such as your lab or any animal facilities. And then the equipment document describes what equipment you have available to do the project. Each investigator is usually required to include a biographical sketch or CV, as well as a current and pending list. And that is a list of current awards and pending proposals. The current and pending list is usually something the grant specialist will put together for you, and then we send to the investigator for their review. This is something that we put together based on the records that we have of proposals on awards that are in our system. The specific Ames doc is simply a list of your objectives. And the research strategy is NIH's version of a project narrative. These required docs will vary depending on the sponsor, so it makes those guidelines pretty important to review. This is just a list of some other documents that may be required. If you're using live animals, or select agents or biohazards, a lot of times you'll have to explain and justify their use. And then you're often required to explain how the results of your project will be shared, especially for projects that are funded with federal dollars. And so that's what the resource sharing plan is. Just be sure to work closely with your grant specialist to make sure that you've got all the required documents for your proposal package. So here at K-State, we use a web-based software to help us assemble grant proposal packages and administer the awards. Most universities these days are now using some type of electronic research administration system. We use a system called Cayuse, and it has two main functions. The first is an internal routing and approval system, which is Cayuse SP. And you've heard me say a few times that all the proposals must be reviewed and approved prior to submission. And so each investigator, their department head, and their dean must electronically sign off on a proposal before Paul Lowe, which is our authorized organizational rep, will provide the final approval before it's sent to the sponsor. The second function of Cayuse is a user interface with the federal proposal applications, and that is Cayuse 424. So Cayuse talks with grants.gov and provides a more user-friendly platform to put the package together. It works in a really similar way to TurboTax or H&R Block when you're preparing your taxes. You enter in your info in a user-friendly platform, and then TurboTax fills in the tax forms for you. Same concept with Cayuse and federal grant applications. This is a screenshot of what Cayuse looks like when you log in. Remember I said Cayuse has two main functions. There's Cayuse SP and the 424. So this screen is part of the Cayuse SP function, where proposals and awards are routed through the university for approval. The PI certification inbox on the left there is where each investigator certifies or signs off on a grant proposal. So if you're a faculty member and you log into Cayuse using your K-State EID and password, and on the left side in the PI certification inbox is where you would go to approve the proposal that you're wanting to submit. So this is what the PI certification inbox looks like. After each investigator signs off on the proposal, then it's electronically routed to their department head and then to their dean. And then the last place where it will land is in the pre-awards office for Paul Lowe to sign off on it before we submit it to the sponsor. So this is a screenshot of the second function of Cayuse, which is putting a federal proposal application together. This is where the grant specialists are most involved in. Many of the required documents in a proposal package mentioned earlier get uploaded in a screen that looks like this. Usually a PI will send the document to the grant specialist. We'll look it over, make sure that it complies with all the formatting requirements and the page limits. And then we convert it to a PDF and we upload it to make sure it's in the right spot. So for the sake of my fellow grant specialists, I do need a moment to get on my soapbox and plead for timeliness when preparing your proposal. We can provide you the best level of assistance if you provide us plenty of time to give your proposal the most thorough review. So please do get started early. I also need to forewarn you as future PIs that if you wait until the last minute to submit, you do risk the proposal not going through. Remember that grants.gov is accepting applications from many institutions. So if you wait until just before a 5 p.m. deadline, there is a chance the system could get bogged down and it won't go through. And if that happens, the feds just won't accept your proposal. Okay, so you submitted your proposal, and then a few weeks or months later, you get great news. Congrats, your proposal has been selected for funding. So you have a new award. Now what? Well, first know that sponsored projects can be referred to by a couple of terms, a grant or a contract. A grant is more of a financial assistance, and a contract has deliverables. An example of this would be a research project that is sponsored by the National Institutes of Health is a grant, whereas an industry-funded research project is a contract. NIH is providing the financial assistance to produce research in a certain area, whereas a company is funding a research project to view the results with data as a deliverable. So when you get an award, the notice of an award will go to either the pre-awards office or the PI directly. The next step is to establish an award or research agreement with terms and conditions. Both parties are going to review those terms. We do negotiate them if needed, and then sign the award or the agreement. Now, we can't negotiate with the feds, unfortunately. They basically set their award terms and conditions and we accept them, but we do often negotiate terms in a research agreement with companies. Once an award or agreement is in place, you will need to have any applicable compliance approvals done prior to getting started on the project. This includes your IACUC approval for live animals or an IBC for biohazards. Once these compliance protocols have been approved, then the grant moves to the post-award side, where Sponsored Programs Accounting is going to set up a grant account, and this grant account is where the expenses for the project are paid from. So now you have your award, your grant account is set up, and you're getting started on your project. So what do you need to do to manage the award? So your responsibilities as the PI are to execute the project as outlined in the proposal. This includes abiding by K-State policies and the sponsor's terms. When you make purchases for the project, the expenses must be allowable, allocable, as in they are for that project and not something else, and reasonable. Your job as the PI is to monitor the amount of money being spent. When grant accounts are set up, the account has categories with deposits of money based on the proposal budget. The expenses may not occur exactly as you plan in the budget, but it does need to be reasonably close. And if not, the budget may need to be revised. You are also responsible for writing and submitting technical reports on the progress of the project. The due dates for these reports are outlined in the award of the agreement, so you will have those due dates ahead of time. So my job as a grant specialist is to assist the PIs with monitoring those budget expenses. One way that we do this in Vet Med is by sending monthly statements showing how the money has been spent. It looks like a bank statement for a grant account. My job is to prepare this and send it every month, but it is the PI's job to look at it. Sponsors not only ask for technical progress reports, but they ask for financial reports as well. So my job is to help Sponsored Programs Accounting prepare those for the sponsor. And then lastly, I can help with the submission of the technical progress reports, but the PI does have to be the one to write them. So sometimes an award may need to be modified because the project isn't happening as planned. Changes can be made with sponsor permission. Time extensions are pretty common. A time extension is where you're not asking for more money, you just need more time. And a budget revision may be needed when a category of expenses is significantly more or less than what was planned. Sometimes an objective or specific aim needs to be changed, or a co-PI or a co-investigator on the project leaves K-State and needs to be replaced. So these are all different types of modifications that are your grant specialists can help you with the process of going to the sponsor for approval. Okay, so now you've completed your project and the award needs to be closed out. So your job as the PI is to write the final progress report, explaining the outcomes of the project. My job as a grant specialist is to help prepare the final financial report on how the money was spent and the internal process to close out the grant account within our own accounting system. So that's a overview of the grant proposal and award process. Bear in mind that your grant specialist is there to help you through each step, and it's just really important to maintain that communication and transparency with them so that they can better serve you. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, thank you for your attention. And now I'm going to introduce you to Mary Lou Marino, and she's going to talk to you about the rules of grant writing.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, so let me get my screen shared here. Oops. Can you see that?
We see your PowerPoint. It's not in slideshow mode.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that because I
Okay.
do have problems moving it forward.
No
I'm
problem
sorry.
at all. We can
Okay.
see your screen, so you're good to go.
Okay, well, I probably should put it at the, rather than having it at the end, I should put it at the beginning. There we go. All right, well, Amy gave you a really good introduction on the sort of the life cycle of the grant, of the proposal process, and then and as well as a lot of the terms. What I'm going to do is give you kind of an overview of what are the rules for writing a good winning grant proposal. Now, the thing I have good news for all of you, in that it's not being able to write a winning proposal isn't an ability everyone is born with. Actually, it's a learned capability. It does take a while sometimes to actually learn how to do this, but you can do it. The fact that you all are here, you're kind of taking the first step in doing that. And so what I'm going to do is just go through a series of rules that I've found that I've developed over the years for helping you to write a really good proposal. Now, the first rule, and it's the most important, that's why it's number one, is you have to have a good idea. If you don't have a good idea, you aren't going to get funded. I don't care how well you write. You're just not going to get funded, particularly in this current competitive situation. Now, of course, you'll say, okay, Mary Lou, how do I know what a good idea is? Well, there are some characteristics of a good idea. First, it has to be significant. That is, it solves a problem, answers a perplexing question in your particular area. It expands the knowledge base. You know, again, you have to have something that's important. Next, it should be innovative. It should be a new approach, a new method, puts ideas together in a novel way. Additionally, if you have a significant problem that you're going after, there probably are others in your area that are also interested in that. And so you need to, your idea should be better than other approaches that you know about. Next, your idea should be understandable. You need to know your audience and make sure that the reviewers are going to understand. If it's way too complex, it's going to be very difficult to explain to your audience, which of course in this case are your reviewers. So make sure that you know, if your idea is really complicated, then you need to figure out ways to kind of get it down so it's more simple. Next, your idea needs to have a payoff. It has to have a benefit to your academic area as well as to society. Current funders, they need often, particularly federal funders, they have Congress looking over their shoulder. And so they want to make sure that if they fund your project, this idea that you have, that, you know, it's going to have a payoff of in some manner. Next, it's really important that your idea withstands vetting. So what you need to do is once you get an idea for a project, you may want to talk to some trusted colleagues to see, you know, if they also think it's a really good idea. All right, now, rule number 2. This is a really important rule as well. That's why it's number 2. You have to start early. Don't wait till the last minute. Putting a proposal together will take longer than you ever expect. Often you need to have, you know, several months. This particular timeline that I have here is something that NIH put out. It's difficult to get funding from NIH, and so they really recommend that you start about 9 months ahead of time. Other agencies, maybe 3, 6. It really depends on how difficult the program is. But the thing that the reason I have this timeline in here is because I want to show you that there are different phases that you should think about when you're putting together a proposal. First, you should have this planning phase, and it can last several weeks to several months. It really depends upon how complicated the project is. But here, what's happening here is you're putting your team together. You are refining your ideas, you know, just really figuring out your goals and objectives. And once you have that done, then you go into what's called the writing phase, where you start the process of putting those ideas and things and working with your team and getting together your proposal. Finally, there's this submission phase. And what this is that you leave enough time, in this case, it's almost 6 weeks that they have here on this timeline, to give yourself time to have others review your proposal, have them give input to you so that you can refine your ideas and make your proposal much better. And then finally, you need to have some time, usually at least a week or so, to meet institutional deadlines. At K-State, one of the things that the pre-awards really likes is if you submit your budget at least a week ahead of time so that they have time to review it. Because again, as Amy pointed out, that's one of the things that is looked at in order to make sure that it's approved for submission. So again, right here is the place that you usually do your budget, which we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay, now, rule number 3, organize before you write. It's very important that you take time to get your project organized before you sit down to write. It will make it much easier for you to put your ideas on paper. So you need to think about what is your problem. You need to be able to be able to say that in like a sentence or 2. And then you also need to figure out why your problem is significant and important. And you have to have proof, because your reviewers are not going to just take your word for the fact that it's significant. So you have to have do some literature review, etc., so that you have the proof that that this is a significant problem. Same thing with documenting why your idea is better. Also, why is it unique and different? And then again, as I said, there's the whole payoff thing. You need to think about what are going to be the benefits to your academic area as well as to society, because most funders are interested in knowing both of those things. And you have to tell your reviewers about that. Now, these 5 questions here are things that you use to put together what I call your proposal themes. These are the things that you keep wanting to drive home to your reviewers as they're reading through your proposal about, the significance, the uniqueness, and the benefits. So again, you may want to take some time and kind of put together a set of bullets that you can look at when you're writing, so that you can keep making sure that your reviewers are understanding why your proposal should be funded. All right, now, again, once you get to the point where you've kind of organized, got these ideas down, then you need to start thinking about what you're going to put down on paper. And so one of the things you need to think about is, you have your project, but then you need to kind of think about what is your overall goal of your research, and then also what's the overall goal of this particular project. And then you need to think about what are your objectives or aims that you need to do in order to conduct the project. And once you have those aims, then the next step is to think about your approach, and then what is your approach for achieving each of your objectives and aims. Now, in terms of the approach, as I said, they should follow directly from your objectives or aims. Again, when you're looking at your approach, you should make sure that you look at it both from the overview or the forest view, and then also relative to the details. Often, if you provide a reviewer with kind of an overview of what you're going to do, the details are much easier for them to understand. And then also you need to think about what are some potential problems and how will you mitigate them. Because if you include this in your proposal, what this does is that it reassures the reviewers that you actually have thought through your project and have thought about some problems and know how you're going to take care of them. This reassures them that you are capable of carrying out your project, because that's another one of the things that reviewers often, well, I always look for that. All right, now, rule number 4. Next, once you've done this organizational step, your next step is to actually put some of your ideas down on paper. And so this problem statement is often the first 1 or 2 pages of your proposal. It's called different things, often the introduction, problem statement. NIH calls it the specific aims, but is really the first section of your proposal. Now, here what you do is you lay out first the significance of your problem, your overall goals, your specific objectives, and then you also lay out what the payoff is going to be if the project is funded. These will usually have be 1 or 2 pages. This is something that you can use in those early stages before you start to write about your project. You can give it to your colleagues and do that vetting process that I talked about before. And they can provide input and you can begin to refine your ideas. Also, another good idea is if you have a funding program that you're interested in, you can talk to the program manager for that. And then they will sometimes actually look at, a 1 or 2 page, one of the problem statements, and they won't tell you whether or not it's going to be funded, but they can tell you whether or not it's something that will fit within their program. If it doesn't, they can help point you to other areas within the funding agency that might be appropriate. Now, when Teresa Merrick, who comes after me, she is going to go into how to do this in much more detail, but this is kind of an overview of that first part of your proposal. And the thing to remember is that these first 2 pages are probably the most important part of your project narrative, because, they lay out for the reviewer what exactly it is you're going to do. And it's very much like a first impression when you do a job interview. This is often where the reviewer will make their initial assessment of whether or not they're going to fund. The rest of the proposal either helps them, that provides pro or cons relative to that initial assessment. So it's very important that this section be very well written. And so if you write it up front, and you get some input, you can really refine it and have a really good first 2 pages, which is extremely important to review, for making a good impression on your reviewers. Next, the next thing, and this is really important, I cannot emphasize this enough, is to start your budget next. Once you have a fairly good idea of what you want to do and you have those first 2 pages fairly well written, you want to do your budget because the budgets, they are really a time suck. They can take 3 times longer than you ever expect. But if you start it early, it helps you figure out whether or not the project that you've put down on these first 2, in your problem statement actually there's enough money within what the funder has to actually fund your project. If and if you're thinking too big, it gives you a chance to to cut down your project. Also, if you're working with other investigators, it also gives you time to work out the split between them, because again, you want to make sure that everyone feels good about the project in terms of the amount of money that they're getting and that they have enough money to actually do what they say they are. And that there's nothing worse than waiting until like 2 days before it's due to work out the budget. I know that all the pre-awards people, it's sort of a nightmare. And as I said, if you do this early, your pre-award specialist will love you, because this is the part that they have to really make sure is making, this is one of the key things that they use to figure out whether or not that the project can actually be the proposal can be submitted. So, and you want to make sure that that you give them time to look at it. And also, if you start this early, many times your pre-award specialist can help you with it. And Anne is going to be going into more detail about exactly how to do this, and to actually put the proposal together, to put the budget together. All right, now, rule number 6. It's really important that you give the reviewers what they want, because the thing to remember is that a cranky reviewer is not going to give you a good score. So you want to make it really easy for them when they review. Now, who are your reviewers? Well, the first is your program manager, because they're the ones that look through the proposals, and then they actually assign the review panel. And then, of course, there are your reviewers. Now, the thing is that the things to do to make sure that you're giving the reviewers and the program manager what they want is to make sure that the project is within the solicitation scope. And this is really important. This is one of the reasons that most proposals are rejected without review, is because they're just not within the funder's scope that they wanted. And so again, you always need to make sure, you need to read that scope of the funding opportunity and make sure that your project fits within it. And don't do it just at the beginning. Do it after you've done your organization, because I've worked on proposal teams, and everyone's really excited about the idea. And sometimes they can kind of meander off scope. So again, make sure that it's within the scope, because there's nothing worse than to get something that you've worked on for 3 or 4 months, to get it rejected without review, and you don't even get any review comments. So be very careful. And the same thing goes with the preparation guidelines. Every funding opportunity will have preparation guidelines as part of it. Make sure you follow them, because again, if you don't, it can be rejected without review. And there's a link to these guidelines for NIH. Next thing, make sure you write to the review criteria. Every request for application will have a section on how it is that your proposal is going to be reviewed. Make sure you look at that. Make sure you have in your project narrative language that addresses those review criteria. Now, Beth Monalone is going to talk in more detail about the review process and the things that reviewers look at. And again, this is one of the areas where you can really help make a good proposal if you make sure that you are addressing those review criteria. And finally, you need to be kind to your reviewers. Remember, many times reviewers, when they're on a panel, this is above and beyond their 9-to-5 job. So often they're going to be doing these reviews on the weekends or late at night. And so you want to make it easy for your reviewer to read your proposal. Because again, I've said this before, a cranky reviewer isn't going to give you a good score. So first, make sure that your proposal is consistent throughout. If you've got aims in the front, objectives, make sure they follow through your approach so that the reviewer can actually see those goals, those objectives or specific aims in the body of your proposal. Next, make sure that you tell a really good, engaging story with minimal word fog and jargon. If you write excited about your proposal, you're going to get your reviewer excited about it too. And if you tell a good story, that really helps. And then make sure that you don't go into that it's written in such a way that there's enough that you have enough information about your area, but there's not too much detail that it's not that everyone, not everyone is going to be as familiar with your project as you are. So you need to make sure that everyone within your discipline is going to be able to understand it. So anyways, now rule number 7, make sure you have a pre-submission review plan. What this means, remember we had that timeline, there was that last phase. Well, you need to make sure that you set up like a review panel, a review group for your proposal, because they can provide invaluable input before a reviewer looks at it on problems with your proposal. And there really are 2 types of review you should do. First, there's the technical review. You should have a trusted colleague look at your proposal, someone that you know will be brutally frank about the issues with your proposal. And again, you need to make sure that you check your ego at the door, because that input, even if you don't like it, is good, because it will help you make a good proposal. And then again, make sure that you're kind to these reviewers, because if you wait till the last minute to engage them, I mean, they aren't going to have time to do an adequate review. So set up several people ahead of time, tell them when you're going to have your draft, and then have it to them and give them a week so that they can really do a good job. Now, in addition, you should have someone who's a proofreader, someone that's not associated with the project, who's detail oriented, that can go through and look at the format, style, errors and inconsistencies, and get those things out, because those careless errors can be really fatal. They can just turn a reviewer off. So make sure that you have a plan to get it reviewed, and make sure you have enough time to do that. All right, now, rule number 8, make your abstract shine. Again, the abstract is like the portal to the entire proposal. It's an overview of what it is you're going to do. And again, like the problem statement, is like where the reviewers and the program managers get the first impression of your proposal. So just like the problem statement, specific aims section has to be well written. Again, because that's the first impression. And as I said before, it's the abstract and the problem statement is where reviewers will make their first judgment on whether something is fundable or not. All right, rule number 9. You need to avoid Porter's pitfalls. Now, who was Porter? Well, Dr. Porter was the vice president for research at, I think it was North Carolina State University. And what he wanted to do to help his faculty write better proposals is that he did a survey of faculty across the country that have done reviews. And he asked them, what are the things that drive you crazy when you review other people's proposals? What are the things that just really bug you? And so what he did is that he compiled the information from that survey, and he put together a list of things that really, really bother reviewers. First, poor fit. It doesn't fit within the scope. Poor organization, you can't see, you have stated goals, but you can't see them in the approach. Weak argument, gyrating jargon, obtuse goals and objectives, an unclear work plan, deviating from the guidelines, ignoring the review criteria, a weak abstract, ignoring your colleagues' comments, errors like typos and misspelling, poor editing. Now you'll notice if you follow the first 8 rules that I laid out, you will avoid these pitfalls. So again, keep those rules in mind. All right, number 10. This is the last one, but it's really important. You need to get on a review panel. It is absolutely the best way to learn what reviewers want, because the process of reviewing helps you be more aware of what should be in a proposal. And it also gives you an idea of what the funder and the reviewers in that program are looking for. Now, a lot of you are going to be early career, postdocs, and then early faculty, kind of wondering, well, gee, I'm so early. Are they going to really want me to do a review? Absolutely. The agencies are always looking for reviewers. Our office, the Office of Research Development, we used to take one early career faculty, usually faculty in their first 3 years. We would take them to DC on a trip, and we'd take them to different funders. And often by the end of the trip, a majority of the faculty on that trip would have gotten on review panels, because funders really like to have young faculty, because they know it's a way of actually mentoring you to help you learn about the process. And now another thing that your more seasoned faculty know is that one of the ways to help you write a really good proposals is that the year before you want to submit to a program, you actually get on the review panel for that program. So it gives you an early insight on what it is the agency is looking for, as well as how the reviewers review. And what will happen is they'll be on that panel in the next year, they're going to submit, and because they've been on that panel, they have a really good idea of how to put their proposal together. So again, this is really a good way to learn. And if you're, as graduate students, one of the things that you can do is to look for some of the internal programs, or some of the activities that maybe the graduate school does to help get on some type of a review panel. But again, once you're in a faculty position or your new job, this is one of the first things that you want to do. All right, so let's go through the rules again. Rule number 1, make sure you have a good idea. Remember, I said this is absolutely the most important rule, because if you don't have a good idea, you're not going to get funded. Start early. It takes longer than you ever expect it to. And when you start early, you have a much better chance of having a good proposal. Organize before you write. If you just sit down and write, you may not have your ideas all together. And this way it helps you to get those ideas on paper. Number 4, write your problem statement, specific aims first, because it gives you time to really write a good first 2 pages, because remember, this is first impression, often where your reviewers make their decision on what their first step in making the decision as to whether or not they're going to fund you. Start your budget next, because it takes a whole lot longer than you ever expect. Make sure to give the reviewers what they want, because if you don't, you're going to have a cranky reviewer, and they aren't going to give you a good score. Make sure you have a pre-submission review plan, because it provides you with the input to help you refine your proposal. Make your abstract shine, because again, first impressions, and you want to make sure you make a really good first impression with your reviewers. Avoid all of Porter's pitfalls. And then finally, get on a review panel, because this is a great place to learn how to write a proposal. Okay. Okay, so here's my contact information. I'm happy to help you if you if you have a proposal that you want to have someone review, as Dr. Monelon went through. Also, I can help you find funding opportunities, and here's my contact information. So anyways, does anyone have questions?
I have one.
Sure.
In the introduction, how much information should you give of the initial concepts? I don't know if I'm phrasing it correctly.
Usually, what you do is the sort of the pro forma approach to this, and Teresa will get into more of this in the next session, but you want to usually have a paragraph that talks about the significance of your project, of what it is you want to do. And then there's like another paragraph where you maybe provide kind of a general overview of what you want to do. And then you give your goals. And then that leads into your specific aims. And then the final paragraph deals with your, the benefits. And so again, those, you have only about 2 pages. Sometimes you can have more than, 1 or 2, you can maybe have a couple of paragraphs. It really just depends. But again, it shouldn't be in a whole lot of detail, because that's what's going to happen in the remaining 12 pages or so that you have in the proposal. But again, it's sort of like an overview of what it is you're going to do.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, if not, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa.
So I do have one question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sure.
with the pitfall, I'm wondering, what is the number 10, like ignoring your colleague's comment? Like
Yes.
how the reviewers will know that we are ignoring, or
Well, they won't, but the way that they will know it is that if you don't have a very well-written proposal, it probably means that either you didn't have other colleagues review it, or you had them review it and you just didn't listen to them. Okay. And that's really what it is that mostly if you ask someone to provide you with, suggestions on to improve your proposal, usually they try to be frank with you. Often they'll be frank in a very nice way, but you have to be willing to accept what it is that they say. So one would assume that if it's a well-written proposal, that often means that you've listened to your colleagues and you've fixed all the problems that they found. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure. No more questions? Okay, Teresa, it's your turn.
Thanks, Mary Lou. I'm just going to share my screen with everybody. And there we go. Hopefully everybody can see my slides if I've shared them correctly. I am going to overlap a lot with some of the previous presenters today, but talk about how the advice you've been hearing so far can work when you actually have to write the grant proposals themselves. So we are going to explore and revisit some of the planning strategies and the pre-writing stages of proposals, where you're gathering information and figuring out what that final document is going to look like. I will show you some features of strong proposals, give some suggestions for drafting and editing so that you feel more comfortable with your writing skills, and that what you're going to produce will also be appreciated by your audience. And I have brought with me today some sample grant proposals that were successful, so that we can take a closer look at what these strategies actually show up as in the proposals themselves. So you've probably heard this word significance used a lot today. I know Mary Lou focused on this really nicely, but proposal writing is really about turning your research idea into a funding opportunity. And you have to figure this out before you capture the details of the proposal itself. That you need to determine why your research matters to your academic field of study, how it contributes to your community at the local level, the regional or the national level, how it might be impacting your university or your organization in a positive way. It also has significance for you personally. It advances your career goals, and it puts you on the path to a strong research credential that you are looking for. And what you want to be doing as you're figuring out the significance of your research outcomes is writing them down. So taking note of how you're thinking through this important concept of proposal writing is a really good habit to get into. Before you're actually drafting, start taking notes and writing this down. Now, what does writing about significance actually look like? The way I like to frame it is to think about measurable objectives. That once you've thought about why your research matters and why it has broader impacts, is you want to develop some of those contributions into something that people can measure or evaluate in a certain way. And so the objectives have to be specific, they have to be tangible, they have to be measurable and achievable. So your research is going to be successful because you have set it up with particular ways to evaluate it. So when you have a goal, this part of the process is turning it into something that we can see and measure. And here is an example of what that would look like in writing. So let's say you're conducting research in education and you want to get funding to start up an after-school program. So this is what a really nice goal would look like. Our after-school program will help children improve their reading. A reviewer on a committee would be like, this is great. This sounds wonderful. We all think that after-school programs can provide a lot of great contributions, but how are you going to make it successful? How are you going to know it's successful? So the objective that is measurable would look something like what you're seeing on the bottom of the slide. We might say our after-school remedial education program will assist 50 children in improving their reading scores by 1 grade level, as demonstrated by standardized reading tests administered after participating in the program for 6 months. So what you'll notice about this objective is that there are several ways that the authors are defining the program itself. There are several ways that its success is going to be assessed and measured. And there is a time frame where we will see a start, a middle, and an end to the funding opportunity and how it will be utilized. And so this is what a good measurable objective looks like. Now, they can be easier said than done. Trying to figure out how to capture something you feel is truly valuable into something that's measurable is part of that kind of tricky first phase of proposal writing. So I wanted to show you a few additional examples to get you thinking about what they might look like. Here's one from the sciences, quite broadly speaking. You'll see a discussion of how the research will produce a database. It will be publicly accessible through open access websites. And it kind of emphasizes why that in and of itself, an open access model, is valuable to the wider public. And so this is a part of the discussion of a grant in the early phases of proving its value. Humanities, sometimes I get researchers saying that they're struggling to figure out sort of measurable objectives because oftentimes their projects are dealing with more abstract knowledge rather than applied. And so I often get asked, like, how can I kind of measure its success in a certain way? So here's one that I pulled from a colleague of mine who received a grant to produce and revise a draft for one of his pieces of research. So you'll see that this discussion here talks about publication opportunities and the way that he emphasizes that it is, in demand by several publishers, the way that people are looking for this research, they want to know more about this topic, this subject area, and therefore it will have an impact to the community that wants to read it, is a measurable objective. So the information here is providing still a means of measuring the research success. Okay. I wanted to give you an opportunity to actually put this into practice. So when I teach writing for all of my students, I often make them write because that's one of the best ways just to dive in, is to be forced to do it. And so what I'm going to give you now is a 3-minute time frame to consider the questions that you have on the slide. What value would your research add to the academic field? So you can think about a project that you're hoping to receive funding for, one maybe you're currently working on with a proposal, whatever you would like to focus on there is great. How would your research positively impact the community outside of academia? What are the most significant impacts of your research? And how can you measure these impacts themselves? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to capture your responses to these questions. What I would like you to do at the end of the discussion or at the end of your thinking is put a measurable objective, just a draft is fine, into the chat so that we can see how you might talk about your research to the wider community. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to think about it. I will remind you when your time is almost up, and then I'll look forward to seeing what you've got in the chat for me. Okay, I'll give you another minute to consider your responses. What you can also do in this time frame is try and prepare a sentence or two that captures why your research matters and how you can measure its impact. All right, I'd love to see some measurable objectives starting to populate the chat. I see one already, Justin. I think that's fabulous. Really focusing on particulars of how you will figure out the success of your research is what review panels want to learn more about. They want to know that not only do you have a great idea, but you know how to carry it out successfully. Awesome, we have some more coming in. As you are filling the chat so we can learn more about your work, this little prompt is something that I encourage you to try yourself while you're working on proposal planning, that forcing yourself to a small kind of time frame or a couple of questions that you write a few sentences for is a really great way to narrow all of the various, in-depth research work you do down to an elevator pitch, down to the essentials that really matter about your work and that will matter to your review panel. So these timed writing prompts are a great way to get at those ideas, because as researchers, you're so familiar with your topic that you sometimes need to force yourself to really get down to the basics and realize how to communicate those to other people. So a prompt like this will form the initial phases of what will become your summary and narrative in the longer proposal. Thank you for all these fabulous objectives or measurable objectives. These are looking really good. So keep doing things like this as you're planning. What I'm going to show you now are a few other things that you'll want to start mapping out during the pre-writing and pre-drafting phases. What I have here is a rundown of the pre-writing 9-step conceptualization kind of mechanisms that are recommended by proposal writing experts. This kind of breaks down the various things that you want to be considering as you're planning for the content that is going to show up in that summary and narrative. Things that might seem really obvious about your work. For example, number one, like understanding the need or the problem is probably something that you're pretty familiar with, but also thinking ahead to other types of issues that surround your work are important to research and map out. During this pre-writing phase, you want to develop good documentation strategies that align well with your writing style, whether that be sticky notes or post-its where you jot down ideas and start putting the pieces together, whether it be outlining in a more linear fashion where you're capturing on paper how you're going to respond to each of these questions or topic areas, but essentially documenting this process so that you have notes down on the page that you can see and consider and think about. That is what pre-writing is really all about. This phase can go really well for some types of writers. It's often a really big struggle for others. I would say I would be included in the latter group. I have lots of great ideas in my head, but actually getting them down can be challenging. And so going through this process is also going through the process of thinking about your work and thinking about its value and kind of going through the motions of determining how you might communicate that to others. And so it's often a big struggle, but if you're doing this and you're documenting the process, it does make the latter phases of drafting a lot easier. One thing you'll want to also be doing during the pre-writing phase is collecting background information, making sure you understand what your organization is asking for, what they're considering when they review proposals, so that you can match those ideals when you put together your summary and narrative. So things that you'll want to pay attention to as you're looking up that organization are their reviewer criteria. Organizations usually provide a great rundown of how they plan to assess proposals and what the review panels will be looking at and considering when they go through and evaluating them. You'll also want to be making sure that you understand what the organization's requirements are for a particular format or for the particular discussion you're going to have inside your field or your genre. That is often a source of panic or anxiety or frustration down the line closer to a deadline if you're unsure of how the writing actually needs to look and what format it needs to go into. So I always recommend looking that up ahead of time so that you figured that out and you can build that planning into the early phases of drafting. You also want to look at how these organizations are talking about their aims, their goals, or their mission. Look at the word choices they use, look at the keywords that tend to pop up in their discussion points on their websites. Because if you can really show that your research matches and correlates with those aims and goals, it's more likely that your proposal will be approved. So knowing what they're looking for and taking note as you're documenting this pre-planning process is really, really important. And just to show you how you might go through a website, I've just taken a screenshot from the National Endowment for the Humanities. This is one of the parts of their website where they explain what they're interested in, what their mission is formulated as, and they provide a description of what their grants have typically done in the past. So you would look through these types of pages trying to pick up on what they seem to really appreciate, what they've previously funded. Here's the NSF. There's lots of great information on their organization's website. You can look at previously successful proposals. You can look at what their goals are and how they break down their organization into multiple areas of research interest. This is what you would mine for as much information as you possibly can. This will give you everything you need to start getting more into that drafting phase. Okay. So let's talk about when you actually start putting together your ideas into a proposal structure. The first thing I want to take note of is that all proposals are different. They vary by field, they vary by organization. And so the advice I'm going to give you is a little bit broad and will need to be specialized to your field once you've actually gotten started with a proposal. But most of these proposals are formulated with some common sections. You're going to have to write a project summary, or sometimes called an executive summary or abstract, which will be a miniature version of your larger narrative. This is an independent kind of piece of writing that functions on its own and has to be written with that in mind. There will also be sections that might be a statement of your need or your purpose. There will likely be a project description. That's your longer discussion where you get a chance to really provide more information about your topic area or your field, where you would probably provide something like a literature review or citation so that you can situate your work into that of other people. This will also be the place where you get to talk through your goals, your objectives, and your needs in more detail. There is writing that goes into some of the other parts as well, the budget and the timeline, your credentials. There's a little bit less involved there, but it's still valuable because the writing will still have to be professional. It will have to be accurate. It will have to be strong in order to be persuasive there as well. But I'm going to focus most of my discussion on the parts that get a lot more writing. And so first I'll look at the project summary. As I've mentioned already, this is kind of a miniature version of your entire proposal. It provides a little snapshot of the key details so that a review panel can look it over in a short amount of time and develop an opinion before they even read the rest of your narrative on whether this proposal has merit and value. It is meant to summarize the key information and not provide an exhaustive rundown of everything your project is going to be about. And it focuses on things that really matter. So it might explain the problem or need that your research is responding to. It will state how your research will seek to solve that problem or fulfill that need. It will specify the parts of the research that you'll need funding for. And it will also include any other particular motivating factors that the organization is asking for. And so that's usually focused on things like broader impacts or the benefit that the project and the funding will have to your own professional goals. This is kind of the why of the proposal, that you're going to use the summary to explain why you deserve funding and why your research deserves funding to other people. The narrative is kind of the meat of the grant. This is where you're going to do the most writing, but you're going to have a lot more space to do so than you did with your summary. It's focused on the same types of questions. You just get a little bit more room to write them out, but you're kind of focusing on a two-part inquiry. You are trying to answer why your project should be funded and also why you are the person to carry this out. So the narrative isn't just about demonstrating the project's value, but sort of proving that you have the capabilities to carry it out, to actually get the research off the ground and to accomplish the goals you've set out. Part of demonstrating that you are the person to carry this out is writing about it effectively. So that's why this narrative is so important to panel reviewers. The narrative gets to go into more depth about some of the project's goals. This is where you can talk more about your measurable objectives, the actual details of how you're going to track your progress. It will explain more about your research methods and the procedures that your research will take. It will give readers a sense of any hypotheses or questions coming out of the research that your project is based on. It will also provide a means of how your project will be evaluated along the way to make sure it's successful. The narrative really walks through the project's potential from start to finish. And in order to do so, it's normal for you to have something like a literature review, or at least citations of some sort to situate your work within your field. And so this will be an opportunity for you to kind of build your project into your discipline and show how it's going to make a contribution. In the narrative, you often have the ability to determine sort of how long it's going to be or what it should look like. But more often than not, an organization does specify some of the types of content and formatting requirements. Those are going to vary by discipline, by organization, or even within organizations, grants can be different. So you want to kind of take a look at what you'll be working with. It's not unusual to have a page count or a word count, and so you'll want to be aware of that ahead of time. The narrative is really meant to provide all the answers to the questions that the review panel might have. And so you anticipate that when you put it together by trying to think about any questions that readers might ask about your project before they would consider funding it. And those questions are going to come from readers who are familiar with your field potentially, but more likely than not are experts from other fields. And so oftentimes you're thinking about any moments of confusion or opportunities for clarification that you might provide for people who are less familiar with your discipline. Okay. One of the best kind of sources of information that you'll use to write those components of your proposal is looking at the reviewer criteria. And that's something that Mary Lou talked about already, and you'll hear more about later on in the workshop. But you'll want to have a really good understanding of how your proposal is going to be evaluated so that you can write it by meeting those needs ahead of time. Reviewers are really trying to answer to the rest of their panelists, do I think that this proposal is demonstrating that the research is going to advance knowledge in the field? Do I see that this has a broader impact? Is it going to benefit society in some way? We want the reviewer to come away with clear, locatable answers to those questions when they go through your narrative and your summary. They also want to make sure that they can understand how your project is put together, that it makes sense, that your topic has been explained effectively. And so they're looking at a research plan that is logical, organized, and easy to follow. And if the more that you can set up your proposal for that to be done efficiently, the more likely it is that they will be inclined to accept your proposal. They are looking for those outcomes. They want them to be things that they can see are measured and clearly connected to the project's goal. Reviewers do like creativity, and they like to see that ideas are novel. They also like to see that you as a researcher have thought uniquely about how to solve challenges out there in the world. And so you'll often see criteria built around the concept of creativity in some way. They want to know that you as a researcher are well qualified and that you have the means and resources available to actually accomplish the research you're saying you want to do. You want to be able to understand the plan of how research is going to be accomplished and what the outcomes are. So there's a lot that reviewers are taking a look at. What they're also trying to make sure they are paying attention to is that you and your project are the right fit for the organization, that the proposal really matches the need of the grant and what they've outlined in the call for proposals, so that they can say, yes, this is the perfect proposal for this opportunity. So you're doing a lot of writing and prepping and planning as you're putting these drafts together. What I'm going to kind of look ahead to now are some proposal weaknesses, kind of thinking about, again, from the perspective of a review panelist, things that they don't typically like or things they struggle with that you'll want to try and account for during the writing process as well. What we tend to hear from panelists is that they really struggle when the researcher isn't clearly identifying and substantiating a significant problem. That might mean that they're not convinced, you haven't argued successfully that your research project has merit and value and that it's a real need. It can also mean, from a writing perspective, that they're having trouble seeing where you're describing these things. They might not be able to point to a particular paragraph or set of sentences that are trying to clearly and directly state why you think your project has merit and how it will be successful. They are also concerned when you're not being specific about the practical details of your project. So, for example, how money might be allocated for the project activities. But this can also apply to a lot of things, that if you're not being clear about how your goals are going to be tracked, measured, and accomplished through kind of the day-to-day, weekly, monthly, or yearly activities that you'll be doing, they will struggle to say that this is a proposal that they can accept. Some other problems that tend to pop up that reviewers often talk about might be that you have an insufficient plan for evaluating the project, that your time schedule just is unreasonable. You've either allocated too much or too little time to accomplish something, or that your methodology is not suiting the scope of the problem. So if you're thinking about these things ahead of time and trying to account for them, you're hopefully avoiding some of these pitfalls, and your proposal will be more successful the first time around. Okay. This last part of my discussion is going to focus on being successful when you're writing. Some of us are comfortable with where our writing skills are at. A lot of us, including myself, make writing a real struggle. So a few things to keep in mind when you are writing your proposals and drafting is that you can really never start too early. And earlier than you think you need to be ready to start drafting is always a good way to go about proposals. This is something we don't want to procrastinate on. We don't want to think about writing as only taking place when you're ready to draft that final version of your narrative or your summary. You really want to start writing your ideas down as soon as you possibly can. This helps to avoid what tends to be the biggest drawback or pitfall to writing, which is really just making the time for it. And so I've provided some quotations from one of my favorite books that I think is helpful for grant writing, but for writing in general, as a researcher. Paul Sylvia has a book called How to Write a Lot, and he talks about the mental barriers that we often put up to writing. We talk about not being able to have time for it. I just need to do a little bit more research. I need to get a little bit more data. I need to read a few more articles before I can actually get my own ideas down. What Sylvia really says is there's never a perfect time to write. And so it's best to be in the habit of writing regularly, often, and early. And that tends to make the process of writing just feel a little bit easier. It's more normal and a part of our day rather than something that we're putting off to the last minute. So one of the best things you can do for yourself, no matter what skill level you feel your writing is at right now, is to build in regular scheduled writing time for your proposal or for any writing you're doing. Build it into your calendar, make it as hard a habit to break as any other important skill that you have to apply day to day. Don't cancel a writing appointment you've put in your calendar, kind of stick to it as much as you can. Make sure that you set goals to keep yourself focused and on track. When you're working on the early phases of the project, especially, you want to be able to map out how much you should get done and accomplished before you get closer and closer to that deadline. Try to, run with what you're excited about, but don't give yourself too much time to kind of wait between those moments. Try not to take any big, large gaps of time in between when you're working on your proposal. Good writers are also people who just let the ideas flow, typically without trying to censor themselves. They get as much as they can down on the page, and they just try not to worry about what it looks like in the beginning. The more you can get ideas down, the easier it will be to revise later. Early writing and early drafting is not about being perfect. And so don't worry at this stage about sentence or word level perfection in the early stages. It's very likely that you're going to revise it many, many, many times before then. And so you just kind of get the ideas down and see how they're coming together first. When you are drafting, also set up a buddy system. Start sharing your writing with people who can be familiar with it as it gets started, as you continue developing, and as you revise and get towards that final version of your proposal. Give it to as many people as will read it and get their feedback so that you can incorporate their responses and their reactions. It's important to share your writing with people inside your field, but it's equally as important to share it with people who aren't familiar with your work, because that way you're kind of getting a sense of what a potential review panelist might be looking at, people who are interested in your topic but aren't experts. Share your writing with those people as well and get a sense of what matters to them. You can, of course, during these early drafting stages, visit us at the Writing Center. You're welcome to work with us for an hour a week to get your ideas going or start putting your proposals together. We can also help with those final revisions when you're ready for that. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of readability, because when I was looking up writing advice for this workshop today, that word came up a lot. That really, the advice was that good proposals are really readable. And what does that term mean? So I tried to kind of flesh that out a little bit. Readability has to do with how well you are crafting your writing for a variety of audiences. Knowing that your review panel is going to be composed of academics in your field, as well as those who have little to no knowledge of your field. So how do you kind of work with that varying level of interest, of expertise, and make your writing readable? So some tips that seem to be pretty successful on this front is to try and make your project and your proposal easy to read and skim. Not every panelist is going to read your entire proposal document word for word, sentence by sentence. Some might just scan the summary and get a sense of what they want to say. Others will be tasked with looking at methodology or looking at your literature review or looking at your schedule or your timeline. Try and make it easy for people to read the parts they want to and not have to try and figure out what's going on in the rest. Readers will also typically skim the document before they take a closer look. And that means that you want to make sure your paragraphs are designed to flow really nicely. Your sections fit nicely together. It has a nice flow to it so that people can go through it quickly. Connected to that idea of flow is to utilize visual design strategies that can help readers orient themselves to the page really quickly and figure out what your document is going to talk about. So a really good piece of real estate on the page for that are your headings and your subheadings, that you can divide up your sections with good topic-specific headings and subheadings that will guide readers from topic to topic or section to section. They can skim those parts of your document, get a good sense of what you're trying to describe and discuss. And that helps with the skimmability of the document as well. When you're thinking about what people might know and what they don't know, as various readers of your proposal, make sure you're considering any definitions that might need to be provided. You want to think about technical or field specific terms that outside audiences aren't aware of and provide definitions for them. You want to develop strong and pointed topic sentences. That means the first sentence of every paragraph or section is very carefully crafted to communicate the main idea of that particular chunk of text. Some readers might only read that first sentence to figure out whether they need to read further. So you want to make that topic sentence count. Make sure you're continuing to read your work to someone outside of your field. Ask them to provide feedback about what they do and do not understand. And then think about how your text can be complemented nicely with graphics and visuals. So we do get asked that in the Writing Center a lot, whether it's okay for proposals to include graphics. I think in most cases, it can be a very good way to communicate information much more efficiently. And so if there are particular visuals that are specific to your field that you think it would be helpful to show your panelists, your proposal can typically include that information as well. Okay, one last set of strategies I wanted to provide before I show you a few examples is to encourage you to read grant proposals frequently and extensively, and to try and get a sense of how good proposals actually make them good. And so what I've included here for your reference later on are some critical questions you can ask whenever you have a proposal in front of you. What you want to be doing is actively taking a look at how that writer is communicating their ideas, how they are organizing their document, and giving yourself an opportunity to analyze whether their strategies are effective. The more you can get a sense of how other people are putting together good proposals, the more you can likely apply those same strategies into your own work, as well as avoid some of the things that you see you struggle with when you're trying to read a proposal. So I'll leave those questions for you for future reference when you have an opportunity to take a look at a proposal. What I wanted to do now is provide you with some actual examples to kind of end the discussion, but to kind of put some of the advice I've been giving today into practice so that you can get a sense of what that means for your writing. My next few slides will have some sample grants on the screen for you, but what I'm also going to do is include a PDF in the chat that has probably a more reader-friendly version of those same pages. So I'm going to put them up right here. It's just uploading now. You should see it in the chat. So it's a PDF of the same grant writing samples. So you're welcome to take a look at that while I'm talking. Here we go. So what I have done is pull a couple of screenshots from grants that I found online. These are all proposals that were successful. They did receive funding and they have been shared so that other people can learn from them. I also think that looking for other sample proposals on your own is a great strategy to kind of see what previously funded proposals looked like for the specific grants you're applying for. In a lot of cases, organizations have that information on their website, or you can find it online, which is what I did. So I encourage you to also take a look for yourself so you can look at some of the successful proposals in the past. This, what you're seeing on the screen here, is a sample project summary. So this is that one-page snapshot of the project that's communicating all of the big ideas. So these slides are going to kind of break down some strategies that I think are making the writing of the proposal successful, and they can be things you can consider for you as well. This project, I think, does a lot of really good things. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that the writer uses the first person to talk about their work. So they say, I'm going to do this, or my work will, or our research will advance the field in this way. Using first person language is usually totally fine by organizations, and it also allows your sentences to be a little bit more direct and concise. And so, you know, unlike other types of research articles or discussions where you have to pull the first person out of the talk and speak more in third person, proposals can use first person language and they can do it pretty effectively. So I think this summary is a good example of that. What you'll also notice is that this heading structure of the summary provides a really great way to skim the page and orient readers to where those pieces of important information are. And these headings aren't particularly complex. This is really just pulling the concepts that the grant specified and asked for and using them as categories to divide up the information. So even though you don't have a lot of space, when you're putting together a summary, using some of that page space to divide up your content with headings is usually really, really effective and appreciated by your panelists. So I think that's another thing that this one does really well. You'll notice at the bottom that one of the headings was more topic specific and personalized. And this was a choice by the writer to really emphasize the way in which their research was going to have value and how it was going to impact particular fields. So even though the previous headings are a little bit broader, they communicate really important information, but you do have the opportunity on this page to make them more specific to your topic. Another thing I wanted to highlight is that you'll see right up in that very first paragraph that there is a clear, locatable research goal. And it's right in that kind of latter part of the paragraph that begins with the sentence, my overarching research goal is to address 3 limiting factors. So you'll see how direct and obvious that language is. And as a panelist, if I'm looking at this summary, I can look for those keywords and my eyes will be drawn to them. I will find that information easily and I'll be able to point to it when I talk about this proposal with my fellow panelists later on. So having that type of clear locatable research goal communicated early and directly is really, really effective, especially in a summary. The language, if you skim the whole thing, and you'll have access to look at these a little bit later on in more detail, are trying to think about how there might be some audience members who don't know a lot of the field specific terminology. So a lot of the middle discussion that provides background and motivation for the research spends time using accessible language and then translating or defining any field specific terms for audiences who are unfamiliar. So this makes the summary fairly accessible to both audiences inside the field and outside of it. And then because we love them, I wanted to point out that this summary does a really good job of highlighting measurable objectives. So they're communicated in the broader impacts discussion. They're identified and kind of separated out so we can easily see how they all fit together. So if you're looking for examples, further examples of how measurable objectives work, I think this is a really good one to take a look at. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to emphasize with this example is that the summary does spend time talking about both the value of the research and the value of the researcher, and that they have the capabilities to carry out the work. So the summary often spends time focusing on both things, and I think the last paragraph of this summary is really nicely articulated and communicates why the researcher has a good team in place, why they're experts and they will be easily able to carry out the goals that they've laid out. Okay, I'm going to move ahead to the next one with a reminder that you'll be able to go back and take a look at any of these in more detail later. I wanted to show you a few different examples of a project summary. So here's another one. Again, just one page communicating all the big ideas, but you can see right away that this one looks kind of similar, but a little bit different. And this may or may not appeal to you in your writing style. So some things I wanted to point out here with this. We have 3 clearly visible sections of content again. We like those heading structures that are similar to the previous example. But you'll notice that when there are longer discussions taking place inside those sections, the writer is using smaller chunks of text. So the paragraphs themselves are probably smaller on average than the paragraph length of a journal article paragraph. That tends to be preferred by panelists so that they can kind of get the information a little bit more easily. They don't have one big block of text that they have to kind of interpret and put together. So if you tend to be kind of a more verbose writer, this is something you might want to pay attention to. How can you divide it up into shorter chunks of text to make it a little bit easier to skim? I think that is done really well and effectively by this writer. You'll notice that with the breakup of ideas into smaller pieces of text, those topic sentences have to work really hard. And so I think this is a really good example of how that first sentence of every new paragraph and section is trying to transition readers from one idea to the next. So that topic sentence is a really good moment to utilize transitional phrases. So phrases that are trying to talk about how what you just discussed is related to what you're about to say. The first sentence of every new paragraph or section is a moment where transitional phrases are very, very impactful. And I think the writer does a good job of doing that with just fairly simple language. This one does not use first person language. So if you feel like your field privileges speaking more in the third person, or if you think the grant organization is asking for third person language, I wanted to give you an example of what that might look like. I tend to find that when you do write in third person about your work, you might have to do a bit more proofreading during the revision stages to make your wording more concise. When we write in third person about what we're going to be doing, we tend to add more word count to our discussion. So that's something I wanted to point out so you can keep it in mind. Okay. What I wanted to show you is another project summary here, but with a highly visual design. Different text, different fonts. You can see that there's often a lot of variation to how these proposals look. I would say of the 3 summaries we've been looking at, this is the most visually designed summary. There are lots of features of the formatting that are drawing your attention to certain things. And I think the writer has chosen those features deliberately so that it's a lot easier for panelists to see the things they need to in the time frame that they're going to be spending working on their material. The headings are being used in kind of those general way, but they've been bolded so that we can see where they are taking place. You'll also see bolded text being utilized inside the section so that we pay attention to really important information. You have the use of bullets in the middle of the page there and then at the end, which I think is a really nice way to break up your blocks of paragraphs, which tend to be harder on the eyes. And so you're welcome as a writer to think about how to design the text in a way that might break up a longer chunk of paragraph into something that's a little bit more visually accessible. So I think this is a really good example of that. You will see with this example that, the first half of your page is really your moment of high impact, that this is where your readers are paying the most attention to your work. So this example, as well as the others, is trying to utilize that space to communicate the high impact information. That usually pertains to your key motivations, the justifications for your project, and the goals. So we communicate those ideas early and concisely to get us going with this project summary, and then we use the rest of the narrative to provide more information. Okay. This is an example first page of the longer project narrative. So you get a sense of how it might differ a little bit from the summary, but might also overlap with some of the information you've provided to your panelists already. A few things I wanted to point out here. This writer used general headings, so introduction, overview, theoretical background. Those are fairly generalized headings. They also use bolded text to call attention to those key details. So this is a feature you can utilize in your narrative so that the reader's eyes are drawn towards things you really want to make sure they see. You'll notice with this one in particular, there's a call out and discussion about this proposal already having been submitted and rejected. But they are trying again because the previous panel found that it had good potential. So this is one example in case you're in a similar situation of how you can work that discussion into your conversation, into your narrative, and really make it clear to your panelists that you've made this proposal better and you've done exactly what that panel asked for. This is a really good example for showing you how definitions can be provided and how you can format them. So down at the bottom, you'll see an example of how that's taken care of. And, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead to one already. This is another example, first page from a proposal narrative. This is also taking a look at formatting. So you can see how this writer has used very topic specific headings. So instead of having a general one like overview, background, description, the bolded heading text is very specific to the researcher's topic and field area. This is a really great way to communicate important information to the people who are skimming through your text. You'll notice that this proposal makes great use of active voice and uses a lot of direct active verbs. So these are the parts of your sentence you want to pay a lot of attention to when you're revising. You want strong active verbs that will keep your actions of your research in focus. They tend to have more strength and more impact to the readers. You'll notice that with this example, there is good use of enumeration. So just, numbers to divide up things into a list to walk readers through more complex topics and items. So the second paragraph does a really good job of that. Here's another page from that same proposal that continues that enumeration, continues similar strategies, and tries to break things down into more manageable pieces of text. And so you are welcome as a writer to think about moments where your research can be captured in this way as well. A research plan or anything that is linear tends to work really well. You will see with these examples that most of the writers have strong word choices that communicate their own confidence in their capabilities. So this is often tied to the adjectives they use or the verbs they use. Good proposals are very clear about how capable the writer and researcher feels. And so, for example, instead of saying, we hope to find that this project will, etc., we say, we expect to find it. That slight word change communicates far more confidence. And so be on the lookout for those strategies when you're revising. One last example I wanted to show you is how you use structure to walk readers through your content. And so just going back really quickly, the research plan on this page of the proposal is divided up into 3 key questions. Those questions are carried out organizationally to divide up the information, where they explained each of those questions in more depth. So this is a really great way to visually signal how all the information is fitting together in those heading moments where readers are taking a look for what they need to learn from each section. Okay, so you are welcome to continue looking through those examples for yourself. And like I say, there's lots available online if you want to take a look at complete proposals and see what's going really well for them. But to summarize my discussion for today, successful proposal writers are making good use of the entire writing process to be successful. They're not just thinking about those later drafts and making them perfect. They are really building writing exercises into all the phases, the planning, the pre-writing, as well as the drafting and editing stages of their work. And one of the best things you can do, which doesn't involve anything, of your own writing at all, is reading successful proposals and familiarizing yourself with what really works. Okay, so I've gone a little long, I apologize. I packed in a lot of examples and wanted to make sure you could see some practical strategies taking place. My contact information is there if you would like to discuss anything in further detail with me. But I'd be happy to answer any questions now if there are any.
Well, I'm Ann Ulmer, and I'm a grant specialist in the College of Agriculture in K-State Research and Extension. I have been working in research administration for about 14 years at a couple of universities. I've worked at both the center level, the college level, and the department level. So I've kind of seen the process from several different angles and worked with lots of different faculty. But today I get to talk to you guys about the budget and the justification. What is the budget? The budget is just a financial plan of the proposed work. So what we've been talking about is kind of the scientific side of the proposal, what we're going to do. And this shows the review panel, the university, and others, what that will look like financially. It identifies expenses that you expect to occur. And these are 2 very important details under there. Those expenses must be directly related to the project, and they must occur during the project period. Those are 2 things that get looked at both pre-award, on the pre-award side, and post-award side, and could be looked at in the case if an audit would come after or during the project. The budget also gives the sponsor a picture of your project and cost. And it's another way or another opportunity to help your reviewer understand your proposed project. So you've told them about the scientific part, how you're going to do what you're going to do, and then the budget gives them a dollar figure to look at. It gives them budget categories, what kind of personnel are going to be used, what kind of test you're going to run, what type of, if you're going to hold meetings or go to meetings. And so it just adds a whole nother layer for you to help the reviewers see your project and understand that you've really thought through this and you know how you're going to put your project into place. Why develop a budget? Well, the sponsor often requires a detailed budget to be submitted with the proposal. The university requires it. This has been touched on earlier, but it helps to determine if the project scope matches the budget limit. So oftentimes we have this great big idea of what we want to do, this project, and it includes multiple components over several years. And maybe that whole project doesn't fit within the scope of what that RFA or what that call allows. So when you start putting the budget together, you might decide, well, this whole project won't fit this call, but I could do this first part of the research, prove that it's going to work, prove that I'm a good researcher, and then go back to that agency or another agency to ask for funding for other parts of the project. The budget also shows the level of detail. The level of detail shows how much you've planned. Do you really have an idea of what this is going to cost, or are you just trying to force your scope of work into the funding that's allowed by the RFA? And then the budget will act as a blueprint for your spending. So once the award comes in, the budget will be put into the budget categories that we established at the pre-award stage. And then as Amy talked about earlier, then those funds will be in those categories that you will spend as you are completing your project. So we have this budget. Who's going to use it? Well, the sponsor is going to use it to determine if your project fits within their scope of funding that they have. The research team is going to use it. You're going to use it as a way to see if your project's feasible, to help manage your funds at award time. And it's the basis of reporting to the sponsor on the cost. So you get a grant from NIH, they're going to send a Word document and money to K-State. But they're not just going to, quote unquote, write us a check and walk away. Like, they want to know how those funds are being used. And then based on your progress report, are you spending in a way that fits the progress that you're making on the project? The department accountant will use it to help follow along the status of your project and the spending of your funds to help you hopefully make sure that those are aligning. Pre-award services will use the budget. They will look at it prior to submission to the agency to make sure that what you are proposing fits within the guidelines of the call, federal regulations, university policy. So you will work with a grant specialist to get your budget in line, and then the grant specialist will send it to pre-award services. They have a budget review analyst. He's a CPA. He will look at the call, look at your budget, make sure that the numbers match up, fringe rates, tuition policies. He'll make sure all of that looks good and is in accordance with the policy, and then he will give us the go-ahead on the budget part of it for submission. And then the sponsored programs accounting, or SPA, will use the budget at award time to set up your account to spend and then to report back to the funding agency. When we are looking at budgets, there are basically two categories of costs that we talk about. We talk about direct cost and indirect cost. Direct costs are those things that can be identified specifically with a particular project. So we have a grad student working on this project. That's pretty easy to say. We hired a grad student to conduct or to do X work, and it is on this funded project. Or we buy supplies for a project. The others are indirect costs, and they cannot be tied to a particular project. So we'll get into details of those, but when you see indirect costs, that term can be kind of under a few different headings. Sometimes they're called indirect costs. They can be facilities and administrative costs, or that's often referred to as F&A or overhead, but they all are the same. I mean, all of those terms show or talk about the expenses of a project or expenses that we cannot tie directly back to a specific project. So when we're talking about direct costs, those things that we can tie directly to a project, we're talking about personnel, other personnel, which are often grad students or undergraduate workers, the fringe benefits that go along with those salaries, equipment, travel, and travel here can be both for the carrying out the project, going to research sites to collect data, traveling, and it can also include like traveling to conferences to disseminate research findings, materials and supplies, publication costs. Oftentimes, once you've been into the project a year or two, you want to publish the data or publish the resulted findings of your project, and to put those in scientific journals is expensive, and so those are typically allowable costs on funded projects. Subawards, this is when we have another group do part of the scope of the project, so it could be a faculty member at another university, a group at a nonprofit, but we will work with that group to come up with a budget, what they need to do for their part of the project, what their scope of work will look like, and then we include that with our submission. And then there's always some other direct costs that tie directly back to the project that we can put there. That could be, we're going to have an outside group run test for us, so that would fall in the other direct costs. Indirect costs are those things that we can't tie directly back or would be incredibly difficult to do so. So clerical personnel, those people who help hire your grad students or your undergraduates, who process their payroll. That's such a small percentage of their job, but we couldn't do it without them, but we can't tie such a small percentage of their time back to a single project. Lights and electricity, custodial services, office supplies, the library, pre-award services are funded as part of the indirect cost, and so are sponsored programs accounting, or SPA. So what is indirect cost? It's the negotiated indirect cost rate. It's negotiated with the federal government. That happens every 4 years. Oftentimes it's referred to as a NICRA. It's typically based on modified total direct costs. I'm going to tell you this, but when time comes to put the budget together, your grant specialist is going to help you figure out what that base is. But when we talk about modified direct costs, things that are commonly, that I see in budgets commonly excluded from the base are equipment, grad student tuition, and then any amount of a subaward over $25,000. But then again, like, that's what your grant specialist is here for. They're here to help you with that. They're here to walk you through that. If you really want to understand it, we'll do our best to do that. If you just want us to help make that part of the budget right, we'll do that as well. K-State's current negotiated rate for on-campus research is 52%. That will expire in June of this year, so we should be looking for a new rate to come out. I don't know, I have not heard anything to see if that will go up or down. But the actual calculated cost of doing research is much higher than that 52%, but the 52 is what the federal government will allow us to use. There are other rates if you are doing research at a branch station or you're doing research off campus. And so all of those things, your grant specialist will help you figure out and budget appropriately for the project that you're working on. So here's what a simplified grant budget will look like. We have our direct cost at the top, salary, fringe, travel, supplies, tuition. We get a total direct cost line. The next one is your indirect cost rate based on MTDC or modified total direct cost. If you look, you can tell that we have subtracted tuition from the total direct cost to get the base. We multiply that times 52% to get what we need to include for direct cost, and that gives us our total sponsor cost. So when we're talking, so let's have a real world, I guess, example of cost groups. Say we are making Wonder Bread. What would be some direct cost of making that bread? Something that we could tie directly back to, say, that loaf of bread or that batch of bread. Some things that we could tie directly back to that: flour, the vitamins, the yeast, the bag, the twist tie, those things where we could all say, we made 500 loaves of bread, so we need 500 bags, and we needed X number cups of flour. So those are things that we can directly tie back to a loaf of bread or a batch of bread. The next is the indirect cost or the overhead, those things that are required to make bread, but we can't really tie back to that specific loaf or batch. Those could include general counsel. We're going to have a lawyer on staff in case something happens. The payroll staff, the oven, electricity, a delivery truck. Like if we're making bread, we're probably making rolls and buns too. So we're not going to send the first truck out with bread and the truck behind it with buns and the truck behind that with rolls. We're going to put them all on the same truck, and it's going to vary each week based on supply and demand, how much bread's on that truck. So we can't really directly tie that back. Another cost category that we talk about with a business, but not necessarily with the university, is profit. If I were Wonder Bread, I would want to make a profit. However, K-State, like most or like a lot of higher education institutions, is a nonprofit, which means it is against the law for us to make a profit. So when you are planning your budget, we can only charge the sponsor for the actual cost associated with the work that we do for them. We can't write an extra, we can't write an raise for ourselves. We can only charge them for actual cost associated. So we talk about profits. What are common unallowable costs, and how do we know what's unallowable? Well, the first way to know what's allowable and what's not is to look at the RFA. If you are working with the National Science Foundation or NIH, most of the time, what is unallowable is a very small section of cost. But if you are working with a foundation or other funders, sometimes that list of unallowable costs can get pretty long. If you're working with, say, the Kansas Corn Commission, most of the time they will not allow you to put equipment on your proposal because the funds that they have available are not very large, and so then they don't want a lot of your budget taken up with a piece of equipment. So first look at the RFA to see what's allowable and what's not. Talk to your grant specialist. Look at the other resources for the funding agency. But below here, I've got a list of those that are commonly unallowable. As a faculty member or somebody on the grant, you can't just say, hey, I think if I'm going to do this research, I should get a $5,000 raise. It doesn't work like that. 9-month faculty can write in summer salary so they can fund part of their time, but it has to be at the same rate that they would get for the rest of their pay. Unrelated expenses, you can't say, well, it would be really nice to have this new piece of equipment in my office. It doesn't really fit with this project, but it would be nice to have in my office. If it's not directly associated and needed for the project, it can't be included. Alcohol, equipment, gifts and advertising, equipment purchased in year 5 of a 5-year project. Again, these are common unallowable costs. There are times that some of those could be allowable. If you're doing research on the effect of alcohol in mice, of course you can buy it, but we'll need additional justification in the budget justification to say why we did include it and it can be included. Budgeted equipment in year 5 of a 5-year project. If you send me a budget that has purchasing equipment in the last year or 2 of a project, I'm going to get a little bit nervous and ask you, why are you waiting so long to buy this equipment? And there might be a good justification. And if there is, that's fine, and we'll include it in the budget justification. But that's something that throws up a red flag with SPA, and it throws up a red flag with auditors. So typically, equipment is purchased in the first part of the project, but if there is a good justification for waiting, we're not really sure, we're going to buy this piece of equipment, but we could buy it, there's different variations of the equipment. We're not going to know until we get through the first step which one's going to be the best service for us. So we're going to wait to buy that. We just need that justification of why we're waiting to buy that. On my last simplified grant budget, I had another line down there. It's called cost share or match. That makes budgeting and getting your project approved just a little bit more difficult, takes a little bit more time. So if you have a project that will include a subaward or match, giving your grant specialist a little bit more time to help you get all the documentation in order is really important. So when we're talking about match or cost share, it's the portion of the project that's not paid by the sponsor. So some agencies will say, we want to help you fund your research. However, we're going to require 25% cost share. So what that means is the agency will give us $100,000 to do the project, and K-State will have to come up with $25,000 to put towards that project as well. So we have to come up with a budget to determine how much is needed to complete the project. And then of that, 25% has to come from K-State or a third party match, a third party who is willing to put money towards this project as well. When we do a match budget, we will do it in the same detail that we do the budget that we do for the sponsor. If on the justification side, we will justify it just the same as we will those funds that we are requesting from the sponsor. So here's what a budget with match will look like. We will have a complete side budget for the sponsor. We will have a K-State or a match column, and then the total. Typically, what is allowed on the sponsor request is also allowed on the match. So you can see we've included indirect cost on both sides. Some agencies won't allow or will limit the amount of indirect cost that can be recovered by the sponsor, but then will allow K-State match. Again, just check with your grant specialist. Like, that's what we're here for. We're here to help, and we want to help make this an easy process for you. The next is the budget justification. So what is the justification? It is just a written explanation of the amounts that you have requested in the numbers of your budget. When we're talking about writing a justification, there are two pieces that we should include in the justification for each category. How we arrived at the amount of that cost and why that cost is needed. So we're going to include salary for a faculty member. This is their base salary. This is how much they earn per month. We want 1 month of salary. The current fringe benefit rate for faculty is 32%, so we're going to add that on. Here's the total that we're requesting, and here is what that faculty member is going to do as part of that project for those funds. Some details here, they seem really common sense, but you'd probably be surprised how many times I go through and fix this. The budget justification totals must equal. If you use a spreadsheet, sometimes the rounding doesn't work. So we go through at the very end and all of those minute details. The justification should be in the same order as the budget. Each agency does it a little bit different, and so we try to tailor that to the agency. Some, like if you're doing a USDA budget, they put senior personnel, salaries and fringe together in one category, and so it's just senior personnel and an amount. NIH is different, or excuse me, NSF is different. You get a salary line and then you get a separate fringe benefit rate line. And so we just try to make it as easy as possible for the reviewers to look through there, match up those numbers, read why we included what those funds are going to be spent for. So if match is required, I would do a budget justification for the requested funds, lead right into a budget justification of cost share funds, and then put the total at the bottom. Some agencies have a limit for your budget justification. For instance, NIA or NSF gives you 5 pages, but 5 pages is a lot of area to write and give a really detailed idea of what those funds are going to be used for. And here's a justification that we probably see all too often. We request $12,000 annually for laboratory materials and supplies. There's a couple questions down here that we can think about. Are these costs allowable? Well, probably, but they're not really giving me much detail. Is this project well planned? Well, it might be, but the budget justification isn't really telling us or showing us that it is. Can the required analysis be performed for this amount? Well, I'm not sure. I don't know how many samples we're going to run or what we're going to have to buy. And is this going to help manage the award spending? Not really. So we see that, we include that, but a little bit more detail would be very helpful for those down the line to make sure that we're doing what we need to do. Here's another budget justification that we might get. This is a little too detailed. You have really thought through all of those pieces of equipment or supplies that will go into there. So that might be a little bit too much detail, but if you have that type of detail, we can combine it into a table that looks similar to this. Year one, we're going to do these tests, this number of tests at this amount per sample. And then you come up with a nice table showing the reviewers, this is what we've thought about, and this is what we're thinking it's going to cost. Here's another budget justification that's just written out. It's not a table form, but it gives you a good idea of what's going to be required. It shows you that we have thought about where we might buy those reagents. It gives you vendors, Fisher Scientific, VWR, and Featuregen. So hopefully they've been looking at those inputs on those websites. They have a good idea of what it's going to cost. Because honestly, when we put this, when we submit this research project in 6 to 8, 12 months later, when you're actually going to start the project, the costs are probably not going to be exactly that anyway, but at least it tells the reviewer that you have really thought through what you're going to do and what it's going to cost. Budget and budget justification are critical to the big picture of your project. It shows that you have thought through what you want to do and how you're going to carry those out. It shows a cost and how they are calculated, and those are influenced by institutional and sponsor policy, government regulations, and the sponsor's RFA. That is all that I have. I would be happy to answer any questions. I can't reiterate enough what previous speakers have talked about. Contact us early, ask questions early. I think I've got a minute. I'm gonna take this. In the last probably 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, I've had faculty not send me documentation until a couple hours prior to submission, and one of them sent me their narrative in single space, and the RFA clearly stated that it had to be 1.5 space. So when you made it 1.5 space, it went dramatically over the page limit. They cut and we got it submitted on time, but honestly, if you have to cut pages out of your narrative at the last minute, we're probably not putting in a great, well thought out planned project. And the other one like sent me her narrative. I don't know, 2 o'clock, it was due at 4 o'clock, and it had URLs in it. And I was like, okay, this agency does not allow URLs in your narrative. And she responded to me and said, thanks for letting me know. I couldn't find it in the guide. And so after it was submitted, I was like, that's what I'm here for. Like, I'm your resource. If you would ask, I wouldn't have even had to look in the guide because I knew that they weren't allowed. So ask so that we don't end up with last minute issues that are either difficult to fix or you don't have time to fix. And also one other note, let your grant specialist know that it's your first proposal. I will use less jargon and be much more helpful if I know that this is your first one, because I'm not going to spend a lot of time writing extensive emails if I think that you have done this before, because I don't just want to fill your inbox in. Or maybe you have submitted several submissions to NSF, but this is your first NIH or USDA. Let your grant specialist know, hey, I've submitted before, but this is my first time with this agency. Because we've probably worked with that agency, and so we'll have a few more resources that we can share with you. So we can be a great resource if you give us the time and ability to help. So does anybody have any questions? If not, I think Dr. Montalone, I'll let you take over.
Thank you very much, Anne. Very comprehensive view of what goes into a budget and what doesn't, and all that good stuff. Okay, so everybody has given you a huge amount of information today about how to prepare a proposal, all of the considerations and all of the components. What I'm going to do now is talk about what happens after you submit it and before you hear that it's either been recommended for funding or declined. So I'm going to talk about the review process. Okay, can you all see my slideshow?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And let's see if it's going to advance. It looks, has it advanced for y'all?
Yep.
Thank you, Megan. Okay. I'm going to give you an overview. Every agency or foundation or whomever you're applying to has its own ways of doing reviews. And what I'm going to do is give you sort of a broad picture, which is hopefully inclusive of the kinds of things you may encounter in a review, but it's not going to be exactly the same for all opportunities that you might apply for. So in many cases, proposal review, and that includes fellowship review, by the way, which is something that graduate students are probably more likely to apply for than a full-fledged grant proposal. have a variety of activities that they might undergo. So, and some of these happen in sequence at the same agency. So usually the first thing that happens when your proposal goes in is that somebody on the staff of that agency will review it and make sure that, excuse me, the proposal is compliant with the instructions and that the subject fits the mission of the funding agency. There's potential that if you just sent a random proposal to a random agency, that it might get bounced at this stage if you didn't do your due diligence. The cornerstone of proposal review for most agencies is peer review. And that's going to be people who are in a comparable position to yourself, or faculty members at other institutions, people that generally work in the area of your proposal. And they will either meet as a panel and discuss proposals, or you may be asked as an individual to review proposals as one-offs and then submit them to someone who is in charge of the group. And then there may be additional discussion by email or by Zoom. Some private foundations don't use a peer review as such. They'll use what I'm calling an expert review. And that's where the foundation hires some kind of expert in the field, and they do the full review process. And then there's also agency review, and this is usually happening for funding agencies as the final step. And this is what's the sort of the second look at your proposal. It comes after the content review, and it's going to look at things like, is this proposal really aligned with the fit? And by fit, I mean our agency priorities, other things that we have funded in the recent past or are wanting to fund in this funding cycle, and so on. So it could be a little more subjective. How do you address agency review? It's kind of hard because you don't always know what they're looking for, but make sure that you read all the instructions in the solicitation to make sure that you fit what they're looking for. At the agency review stage, there may also be a separate review of the budget by expert accountant type folks who are going to catch more than, say, a peer review panelist will. Okay, if there is a budgetary review, this is going to sound a lot like what you just heard from Anne. They want to make sure that the budget is reasonable for the work you proposed and that it's realistic, that you justified it well, and that in your proposal, in the narrative, as well as in the budget justification, you've described why the work is important, why it should be done. And then in the budget justification, you've described how the budget you're requesting is in line with what it would take to do the work. And then, of course, your budget needs to be aligned with the program. In other words, if their maximum award is $500,000 and your budget has come out to $750,000, I don't think that's going to go over too well. And in all of these review processes, there is sort of a death knell option, if you will, that no one ever wants to have happen to them, which is return without review. So in other words, you sent it in and there's something so fatally wrong with your proposal that they say, we're not even going to take time to review this. We're sending it back to you. Try again, or maybe try again somewhere else. And so why are some of the kinds of reasons you may get this unhappy outcome? Well, the biggest and most likely way to get that is to not follow the guidelines. And then there's multiple subsets of that it doesn't fit the funding by the agency, that you either that the deadline is too late and you want too early a start of the project, that's the insufficient lead time part. Another problem is if there were 2 phases of the proposal submission. There was a preliminary proposal that had to be approved before they invited a full proposal. And if you were not invited, but you submitted a full proposal anyway, figuring, you know, maybe, that's usually a no. And then another thing that funding agencies get annoyed with is if you're sending either a duplicate proposals to multiple agencies at the same time. Say, for example, you send the same thing to NIH and NSF. They don't like that. They also get mad if you have submitted once and your proposal has been declined, and then you just turn around and send the same thing back without even trying to edit it or make it different or improve it. Other ways you can go astray is that you don't follow page limits or formatting. Anne just gave you 2 examples of a proposer that almost fell into that trap. If you don't have your electronic submission work, that's a problem. And so the main thing is read the solicitation and any other documents that they've got. If there are frequently asked questions available on a program website, read them. Make sure you read all of the information they give you. And of course, if you missed the deadline or didn't respond to the solicitation, just sent them something totally from left field, they're not going to like that. And then this final point is what I referred to on the last slide, is that you've already been declined once and you haven't really tried to address the changes. Most agencies give you very explicit instructions about addressing any critiques of a prior review. Okay, so let's get out of the death knell stage and go into what the overall timeline might look like. The example I've given you here is for NSF, but this is not atypical of other funding agencies. Now, smaller foundations, for example, or regional organizations may have a quicker process because they're probably not reviewing as many opportunities, or they're not awarding as much money, or both. But the big funding agencies, this is kind of a typical timeline. So the first phase in green is what you're doing. You're watching for opportunities to come out, and you're seeing, yes, I want to apply to this one. Then you're doing all the work that has just been described by all of my colleagues, and you're preparing your proposal and you're submitting it. And then in number 3, the agency gets it. Okay, so what does the agency do? Well, they don't just throw the proposals down the stairs and pick, which ones went the farthest to fund. That's not what they do. They've got a formal process, and this may involve selection of peer reviewers and a panel. The program officer has to take any the reviews that have been collected and consider all of those and make their decisions and recommendations. And then there's going to be some upper level review. And in the case of NSF, it's at the stage of the division director. And so the division director is going to get all the program officers' recommendations for that funding cycle. And then they're going to have to figure out who they want to fund. And then once that's happened, you may think you're done, but no. Now there's this award processing phase in orange. And this is where they make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, that the institution, K-State, is in compliance with all of the federal guidelines, that there's not a previous proposal that you or someone else at the institution has had that has not submitted, say, a final report that is overdue. All of those things can hold up an award or prevent an award from happening. So once all of those steps have taken and pre-awards gets the notice of award, that's usually another month from the time of recommendation for funding. So you just gotta wait, and you just have to be patient. I'll talk a little bit about the review criteria that the big federal agencies use. NSF is kind of well known for having what they call 2 National Science Board approved merit review criteria. And one addresses the intellectual merit of what you're proposing and its potential to advance the knowledge in that discipline. The other is the broader impacts. And what NSF means by broader impacts is, will this activity, will these findings benefit society in some way? And will they contribute to accomplishing something that is considered desirable by the federal government and by NSF in particular? And that could be something like, producing more science and engineering graduates, diversifying the science and engineering workforce, increasing scientific literacy among the general population. There's a whole bunch of those. So how is intellectual merit is reviewed? This should probably seem obvious to you. If this is what your peer reviewers are looking at. What's the quality of the work that's being proposed? Is it likely to advance knowledge? How well qualified is the proposer, the PI or the PI team? And this, they'll do things like read your biographical information and your bibliography. To what extent is the proposal original? How well organized and conceived is your proposal? And is there sufficient access to resources? So if you're proposing a huge study that involves access to, say, radio telescopes, just as an example, and you are at a small liberal arts institution that doesn't have any radio telescopes, how are you going to be able to do that work? Now, it's not impossible that somebody in that circumstance could do that, but they would have had to have that described in their proposal. Broader impacts, I'll just say a little bit more of that. So the broader impacts, depending on the project, could be accomplished through the research or the project itself. So it just depends on whether it's something that's potentially, say, transformative in developing technology that could help particular segments of society. It could be some kind of, say, new economic model that could help solve a societal problem. And there's a lot of examples like that. There's also usually add-on activities that are more directly coming from the scientific projects. And these are things like training students or training early career researchers, such as postdocs. And then you can also have complementary activities. And I'm going to cough, just hold on a minute. Sorry about that. And these are things like doing additional educational activity for high school or elementary students. How are your broader impacts evaluated? I'm not going to read all this, but these are the kinds of considerations that NSF looks at for broader impacts. And these are all spelled out on the NSF website and in the proposal guide. So if you're submitting to NSF, read that stuff. Okay, again, using NSF as an example, what kind of feedback do you get from your merit review? Well, they're going to send you the verbatim copies that the individual reviewers developed along with their scores, and they use a 5-point scoring system: excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor. They will have a specific analysis of each of the intellectual merit and the broader impacts that's present as a summary paragraph on the review. And then you'll also receive a summary of your proposal strengths and weaknesses. If the proposal was panel reviewed, you'll also get a summary of that panel. And then they'll give you what they call a context statement, which is the number of proposals reviewed, sometimes how many people were on the panel, etc. Okay, I'll just give you a couple of highlights from 2 other funding agencies. NIH, I mean, their process is very similar. The details are slightly different. So in NIH, there is a peer review by a scientific research group. That's your panel. And their scoring system is a little different. It's a 1 to 9, where a lower score is good. And they're going to evaluate the same kinds of things. And they'll also comment on the budget and other kinds of issues that are relevant to the proposal. So you'll get multiple scores between 1 and 9. And then you'll get a final overall impact score, which is the mean of the panel multiplied by 10. So the final scores for the panel will be from 10 to 90. Now, if that's only for about the upper 50% of proposals, the lower 50%, you won't get the individual score. What happens there is that they're not discussed at the panel, and you will get a score of ND back. And those are not so helpful if you get those, obviously. And then you'll get a summary statement that's got the overall and individual scores as long as it was scored, and then a percentile of how you fit in that study section if it was scored. The second phase of NIH review is that it goes to a council or a board, which is a group of external scientists and representatives of the public. And what they're going to do is, this is sort of a fit review. They're going to look at all of the impact scores in the study sections. They're going to look at summary statements, and then they're going to say, how well does this align with the institute or center's priorities? And then the director of the institute or center is the one who determines the final status of the funding, of who's going to get funded and who's not. And another thing about NIH that is interesting is that some centers and institutes publish what they call a pay line, which is the projected percentile level for funding. Note that those are just projections, they're not guarantees, but they can give you an idea of how competitive the different councils are. Okay, USDA NIFA. This is going to start to sound real familiar. They have a panel manager who is usually a researcher who's on temporary appointment to the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and they lead a panel of reviewers. So peer review, just like we saw with the other agencies. They will write written reviews. They will give scores. They use the same rating scale as NSF does, or numeric equivalents thereof. They will discuss and determine a consensus and the ranking ones, and then all of that stuff comes from the program officer back to the PI. Okay, so where do the funding agencies get reviewers? A bunch of places. They're looking for 2 kinds of reviewers in general. They're going to want the content experts, of course. And then depending on the panel and what kind of competition it is, they may want just a bunch of generalists as opposed to specialists. And this is particularly true in more wide scale proposals like those involving, say, science education, or sometimes the fellowships get reviewed by a broader array of reviewers, because there will be a whole collection of specialties within the fellowships. And how do they find reviewers? Well, for one thing, the program officer is going to have a lot of connections. They also look at the references you list in your proposals and say, okay, who's the experts in these areas? They'll look at professional societies and see who is invited to speak on topics related. They'll do computer searches. You know, they probably use Google like anybody else would. Some of the agencies have regular panels that have continuing membership. Others are all contrived on an ad hoc basis with different reviewers every time. The other thing that is important in reviewer selection is that there are not conflicts of interest. And all reviewers at the start, or even before a panel, will have to declare whatever conflicts of interest they may have. So it may be obvious why you would want to identify conflicts of interest. And the primary purpose, of course, is to prevent, connections like, this is your home institution. They're not going to ask somebody from your home institution to review your proposal. And it also, that this is one of the other reasons they look at, who you were a graduate student with or who you were a postdoc with, because they're not going to let your graduate student major advisor review your proposal. But the second purpose is a much broader one, and that's to preserve the integrity of the review process. Make sure the scientific community trusts the process, also trusts the government, and the public has confidence in the process of federal peer review. So we're getting down to the end. How are funding decisions made? They're made by the program officers that I've just mentioned to you, the program directors, the program leaders at USDA, the institute and center directors at NIH, comparable individuals at other kinds of agencies and foundations. As I said before, the actual awards are going to be made through essentially the business offices, the grants and agreements units. And one of the things that they will take into account is that the institution has the ability to manage grants. And I also mentioned this second point earlier, that there's not overdue annual or final reports or compliance issues or outdated assurances. So all of those can hold up an award. Okay, so now you've gone through all that and your proposal is declined. And now you're very depressed and you're wondering why. Well, short answer is it just wasn't considered competitive.
Yeah.
And it probably had some flaws that may have been identified. More often though, and sad, is that there were more competitive proposals that might have been funded than they could fund because the program just didn't have enough money. And then they're going to have to decline some of the ones that might have had a shot otherwise. So if this happens to you, should you revise and resubmit, or should you just decide to leave science forever? Well, I would revise and resubmit before I was so drastic. And the questions you should ask about resubmitting to that same opportunity is, did they identify strengths in your reviews? So did they have good things to say about it? Among the weaknesses that they identified, are they things that you can address, or are they things that are out of your control? And then the last thing to think about is, are there other ways that are not either that you already had strengths or you can address the weaknesses? Are there other things you can do, like maybe bring in a new collaborator, use a different approach that could potentially strengthen a resubmission of that proposal? And I would always urge someone who's been declined to contact the program officer and ask them if they will discuss your proposal with you after it's been declined, because you can get a lot of insights that way. So I will leave you with this thought. A good proposal. We all want to write a good proposal. It's a good idea. You've expressed it well. You've written your methods out clearly. You have described the idea, how you're going to evaluate your findings, and how you will disseminate that information. Is that enough? No, you want to have a competitive proposal. And the competitive proposal is all of those things under good. It's also appropriate to the program. And it's responsive to the program announcement, to that solicitation. Why is that asterisk? Because that is the most important thing. So the first thing you need to do, the last thing you need to do before you submit is thoroughly read the program announcement and make sure you are addressing everything in it. And that's all I have. So I will address any questions you may have. How would different agencies? They talk to each other. That's how. I see this as a direct message question. How would different agencies know that I submitted the same proposal for multiple ones? And first of all, you are supposed to, in almost every federal agency, you have to submit a document called current and pending support. And you have to list all of the pending proposals you have, as well as your current support. So that is, something that if you lie on that current and pending support document, you potentially could be, liable for fraud with that. Secondly, they will talk to each other. If it looks like a proposal that is potentially fundable by, say, NSF Biology Directorate and NIH, and you've previously submitted to one or the other, they may call up the program and find out if you've got a new submission in that, say, went in after you submitted to the first agency, and so you didn't have to put it on your current and pending, and say, have they got a new submission? So they have ways. Any other questions? Well, I'm going to hand it back to you, Megan, but I will stress that all of us are happy to, consult individually with anybody on this. Email usually works the best, but feel free to reach out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our presenters. That was a lot of really valuable information. For any of the attendees who didn't receive the email this morning, the presentation files are in the chat if you can access them. And if not, then just let me know and I can get those to you. Other than that, I think that's everything and we're good to conclude unless anyone has any last minute questions. One last call for questions for any of our presenters. You guys did a good job because there's not a lot of questions, so lots of good information. Perfect. I think we're good. Thank you so much for all your time and effort in putting this together.